On a warm afternoon in 1984, two sisters left a home they knew well and vanished into a part of the city that would not stop haunting their family for decades. The immediate shock was the absence of motive, the absence of witnesses, and the sudden, terrible silence that fell over everyone who loved them. Police searched, neighbors whispered, and the case cooled into a long, stubborn ache. A cold file on a crowded shelf. Early leads were thin. There was no purse, no wallet, no ID. Clothing was disturbed, shoes were oddly positioned, and evidence suggested a violent, sexually motivated attack. Investigators recorded every detail they could. The position of clothing, the state of the bodies, traces collected carefully in the days after the discovery. For a time it felt as if the crime had been frozen in time, caught between the moment it happened and the one where justice might finally catch up. Over the years, theories bloomed and withered. Could a known predator from the area be responsible? Had someone used a crude ruse to lure the sisters away? The town remembered other violent acts, and fears hardened into suspicion. But the patterns never quite matched. Profiles and suspects were considered and eliminated. Evidence that once promised answers grew cold. The case file gathered dust, while the grief never did. Decades later, as policing embraced new science and new persistence, the case reopened. A dedicated cold case team began re-examining unsolved homicides with eyes trained for what forensic science could now reveal. DNA technology had leapt forward. Laboratory techniques that were science fiction in the 1980s were now routine tools. Swabs, slides, and the smallest particles of biological material could carry the identity of a killer across decades. The breakthrough came from patient, methodical work. Technicians reprocessed the original evidence. Items that had been stored, a boot, a jacket, a pair of socks, were submitted to modern analysis. Where earlier exams had found nothing definitive, new methods revealed something small but crucial: a trace of male DNA on the sole of a boot. The discovery changed the direction of the investigation. It transformed cold frustration into prosecutorial possibility. With a DNA profile in hand, investigators turned to databases that did not exist at the time of the crime. Traditional criminal databases could only help if the offender had previously been processed by police. But the genealogical revolution had created another path: public DNA databases where users voluntarily shared their ancestry profiles. Genetic genealogy, the technique that had recently solved several long cold cases, offered a way to work outward from a profile by identifying partial matches and constructing family relationships. A genetic genealogist spent weeks sifting through leads, matching segments of DNA to distant relatives, and piecing together branches of a family tree. Each partial match narrowed the pool: siblings, cousins, and then possible fathers and sons. The search produced a cluster of related men who could plausibly be the source of the crime scene DNA. That cluster became the investigative map. From there, the detectives used old-fashioned legwork. They reviewed arrest histories, talked to neighbors, and reconstructed life events and addresses from more than 40 years earlier. One name rose to the top: a man who had been in the area at the time and who carried a history of sexual offenses. He had never served long prison time, but a deferred prosecution from years prior put him into an alarming pattern of conduct that investigators could not ignore. But genetic genealogy does not yield a courtroom-ready match on its own. To secure a criminal charge, law enforcement needed a direct DNA comparison. The challenge was to obtain a known DNA sample without alerting the suspect. Detectives adopted a careful surveillance plan. They followed the man during ordinary routines, waiting for an opportunity to collect an item he discarded that would contain saliva. The gamble is common in modern cold case work. A coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a straw, or a napkin can become the crucial link. When the chance finally arrived, investigators moved quickly. They recovered a discarded coffee cup from a public trash receptacle, placed it into evidence, and sent it to the lab. The forensic testing matched the DNA from the cup with the crime scene profile. The breakthrough was absolute. A genetic connection between the decades-old scene and a living suspect. After more than 40 years, there was finally a name that investigators could take to court. Charges were filed. The accused was brought into custody. For the families who had carried the unanswered questions, the arrest felt like a long-awaited turning point. Memories and pain resurfaced. The small, everyday things that had been lost to time, laughter at the dinner table, holiday photos, the texture of the sisters' lives before violence cleaved them away. Hope was tempered by the knowledge that even now the path to accountability could be complicated. Court proceedings began, and with them came the old, uncomfortable scrutiny. The defense contested the origin of the genetic evidence and raised procedural questions about how it had been obtained. The prosecution relied heavily on the DNA connection and on the genealogical work that had led them to the suspect. Neighbors and old acquaintances testified about behavior patterns and suspicions that had long ago been dismissed as gossip. The trial wove science and testimony into a narrative that sought to reconcile forensic certainty with decades of unanswered questions. During the process, the accused made troubling choices. Facing the weight of new evidence and the prospect of trial, he took his own life while in custody. His death closed one chapter in a way that offered mixed closure. On the one hand, the families finally knew who had been responsible. On the other hand, they were denied the public reckoning that a full trial would have provided. There was relief, grief, and a complicated sense of incomplete justice. Yet the jury still convened and returned a verdict of guilty in absentia, a symbolic but meaningful validation of the work the detectives had done. For the families, the guilty verdict affirmed what they had long suspected, that the pain that shaped their lives had not been arbitrary. The legal finding, even without the accused present, allowed them to speak of the outcome as a form of accountability. It also underscored the power of scientific progress to reach back into the past and offer answers where there had been only silence. This case is more than one family's tragedy resolved by technology. It is a story about the changing face of investigation and the persistence of people who refuse to let victims be forgotten. The rise of forensic genealogy has given law enforcement a new tool, but it also raises hard questions about privacy, consent, and the reach of genetic data. Communities wrestle with the balance between the promise of solving brutal crimes and the rights of individuals whose DNA might be used to point toward a suspect. For the sisters' family, science finally returned a sliver of peace. They had carried grief for decades, but they now had evidence to point to, names to say aloud, and a legal acknowledgement that the lives lost had been taken deliberately. The work of detectives, genealogists, lab technicians, and prosecutors converged to create an answer when answers seemed impossible. They finally breathed easier together. The case leaves a complex legacy, sorrow that cannot be undone, gratitude for those who would not let the investigation die, and a cautionary tale about the ethical terrain of modern forensics. Above all, it is a reminder that time, even when it obscures and erodes, does not always protect the guilty. Science and persistence can, at last, bring truth into the light.